rear, bringing the vehicle to a halt in Dealey Plaza to ensure that Jack would be killed. And as I'll explain, during that period of time, he was hit twice in the head, once from behind. He fell forward. Jack eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple with a frangible or exploding bullet. And I'll elaborate on all of this. Once they got to Parkland, Secret Service agent got out with a bucket and sponge and started washing the blood and brains out of the limousine, which of course was destruction of evidence. There were pedestrians there, including a motorcycle patrolman who observed a through-and-through hole in the windshield and even put a pencil through it. And at that point, they moved the limousine where it was out of the visual field of any of the spectators. The limousine, although it was a crime scene on wheels, was sent back to Ford Motor Company on Monday. It was completely stripped down and rebuilt from the bottom up. We even located the official who was responsible for replacing the windshield and confirmed that indeed it did have a through-and-through hole in the windshield. This vehicle belonged in the Smithsonian. I mean, to talk about your massive destruction of evidence. The event occurred at 12:30. The president was pronounced dead at 1 o'clock. At 1:30, Malcolm Kilduff, the acting press secretary, came out to explain it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head while pointing to his right temple. This is the arrest record on Lee Oswald, which is dated 1:40 p.m. Now remember, the assassination only took place at 12:30, so here in about an hour or so, you already have an arrest record, and it's quite a stunning one because it says, this is just an arrest record, mind you, for a man who walked into a theater without paying a ticket. This man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy, and police officer J.D. Tippit. A shooting of a police officer occurred in a completely different part of town under completely different circumstances. I'd be happy to address that issue, but you know, the claim being made here is really presumptuous, and also shot, you know, and wounded Governor John Connally. I mean, just saying at 1:40, no investigation whatsoever. Already they're picking this man up and writing this up. At 3:15 in the afternoon, there was a medical press conference with Kemp Clark, who's on your left, and Malcolm Perry, MD, on the right, who had performed a tracheostomy through the wound to the throat. Malcolm Perry reported 3 different times that he had an entry wound to the throat. The bullet was coming at him. He was very explicit with the reporters. Kemp Clark was the head of neurology who pronounced him dead at 1 o'clock. What's most interesting about the Parkland press conference is that no transcript or recording was ever made available to the Warren Commission on the grounds that there was so much there in the record it would take a long time to discover it, except if you think about it, news coverage of the assassination, one of the very first things that would have been covered would have been this press conference. Obviously they want to introduce evidence of shots from in front into the record, especially when you had a medical expert, and these physicians at Parkland were well versed with gunshot victims, since Dallas at the time may have been the homicide capital of the universe, whereas the 2 physicians who were principally responsible at Bethesda had never attended a gunshot victim before. Here, when we talk about the photographic record, is a famous backyard photograph allegedly taken by Marina. This was published on the cover of Life magazine and was widely used to impugn him as having been guilty. Oswald was actually shown the photograph and said that was his head pasted on someone else's body, that he knew something about photography and he'd eventually be able to prove it. Other students have noticed here in relation to this that the fingertips of his hand are cut off, that the shadows for the eyes and the head don't seem to correspond to the shadows for the body. You'll look, just by coincidence, he's holding the Mannlicher Carcano and a revolver and a pistol belt with which he's alleged to have killed Officer Tippit. And I might well mention at this point of time that the original officer on the scene of the Tippit shooting had found 4 shell casings. He'd initialed all 4 of them. They had been ejected from an automatic, and they were of 2 different manufacturers. A woman across the street at Quilla Clemens said 2 men had shot Tippit, and neither of them looked like Oswald. Now, can you imagine, you know, a revolver doesn't automatically eject its shell casings, and it's fairly absurd to imagine that Lee would have shot this officer 3 times in the torso and then an additional shot in the right temple, interestingly, and then opened his chamber and pulled out his shell casing. It's also odd, of course, that there was a mixture of different manufacturers, 2 by one and 2 by another. Western and Remington Rand, as I recall. Subsequently, however, there was a change in the evidence, and now these were shell casings from a revolver. Now they no longer had the initials of the officer. Now there were 3 of one and 1 of another. In any case, there's also an insert line right here, okay, just above the jaw, just below his lower lip. And that jaw, notice, that isn't a jaw that sort of comes to a point and has a cleft. That's not Lee Oswald's jaw. We did additional research about that photograph that I will report to you as we proceed. So just notice here in that, officially, the location of these 2 wounds that the president allegedly incurred. And remember, Connolly is collateral damage, because according to this report, he's not hit by any shot directly, but only by the shot that enters here. And even in the diagrams, this location moves around a bit. And then this shot to the back of the head with this massive blow up to the top. We're going to find that there is no supporting evidence for these claims, but I want you to understand that they're basic to the government's position. I mean, just to see how far off they are, here's the jacket that Jack was wearing. You find that there's this entry, there's a hole in the jacket, about 5.5 inches below the collar, and just to the right of the spinal column. Here's a hole in the shirt he was wearing. Again, it's about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. During one of his visits to the National Archives, David Mandick asked members of the staff to put on the shirt and jacket, and discovered the hole in the shirt was slightly below the hole in the jacket. The shirt and the jacket, interestingly, were left at Parkland. In violation of standard autopsy protocol, they were not taken to Bethesda and were therefore not available to the physicians who performed the autopsy. Nevertheless, it's rather fascinating that J. Thornton Boswell, who was assisting Commander Humes, these are 2 Navy pathologists, but they've never performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim before, wrote, identified in this drawing right here, a wound of the body. Okay? So you got a wound in the body, and this one is verified by Admiral Berkeley. Now, the whole point of an autopsy diagram, obviously, is to give an exact positioning of where the wounds are located. So here we have this wound to the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar, that is even certified by Admiral Berkeley. 2 FBI agents by the name of Siebert and O'Neill were also present during the autopsy, and Siebert made a diagram that showed the wound to the back here lower than the wound to the throat, They also described it based on the physician's description, and now they brought over an Army lieutenant colonel by the name of Pierre Fink, who actually had performed gunshot autopsies before, but it had been some time since he was basically responsible for reviewing files during this stage of his career. And Fink probed this and reported that there was a very shallow, in about a second knuckle of your little finger, no point of exit, at a downward angle of 45 to 60 degrees. So here you have the shallow shot to the back with no point of exit. Admiral Berkeley himself executed a death certificate on JFK. You'll be surprised to learn there are like 4 of these little beauties. It's as though the more documentation they had of his death, the more assured they could be that he actually was dead. And Admiral Berkeley reported he was killed by a shot to the head. The wound he didn't describe further, but he went on to say that there was an additional wound to the back at the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. Okay, that's a medical physician. He's using medical terminology. Just so happens that 3rd thoracic vertebrae, as you can see here, corresponds to approximately 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. Now, sometimes the claim has been made that the reason you had these holes in the shirt and the jacket is because his jacket was bunched up. This has always been, to me, an incredibly implausible claim to make, especially since Jack Kennedy was a wealthy man. He wore custom tailored shirts and jackets. They're just not going to bunch up. There does appear to have been a late alteration to a film that was recently claimed to have been discovered, where you do see some bunching up. And I'm convinced this is a fabrication. There was an article about it authored by Gerald Posner in the New York Times, and I wrote a response explaining why the argument was severely flawed, and given all the other evidence, we had to infer that this film footage had been fabricated. But the point I would make is, hey, even if you could account for bunching up, the shirt and the jacket, that's not going to account for the wounds in the body. So we've got wounds in the body that correspond to the shirt and the jacket when they're not bunched up. There's no reason to think the custom tailored shirt and jacket are going to bunch up anyway. And this appears to be just a diversion.